Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. Each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. I'm here with Matt and Simone, and this week's story is The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells. Matt, you picked this story. Can you tell us a bit about it?
I can, and it comes with some interesting news. And the podcast is coming to an end, I suppose. It's been fun. We're not leaving. We're having a new podcast that we're going to start soonish. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're still planning it. I will update all the listeners when we get that sorted. But this may be our last story. And since it was our last, I thought, why not go back to the same author that we started with? Let's revisit H.G. Wells. And I had a great time reading some H.G. Wells stories. And this one was my favourite. It's kind of charming and nicely self-contained, similar to how The Magic Shop was, all that time ago.
Yeah, I agree that I've read a few H.G. Wells stories, and I really think if you want to read Victorian short stories, he's the guy to read because all his stories are so neat. They all work well. He has really interesting concepts, and I have much more respect for him as an author than I did before we started with The Magic Shop all that time ago. So yeah, I really enjoyed this as well. Here is The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells.
The buying of orchids always has in it a certain speculative flavour. You have before you the brown, shrivelled lump of tissue, and for the rest you must trust your judgment, or the auctioneer, or your good luck, as your taste may incline. The plant may be moribund or dead, or it may be just a respectable purchase, fair value for your money. Or perhaps, for the thing has happened again and again, there slowly unfolds before the delighted eyes of the happy purchaser, day after day, some new variety, some novel richness, a strange twist of the labellum, or some subtler coloration or unexpected mimicry. Pride, beauty, and profit blossom together on one delicate green spike, and, it may be, even immortality. For the new miracle of nature may stand in need of a new specific name, and what so convenient as that of its discoverer? John Smithier. There have been worse names. It was perhaps the hope of some such happy discovery that made Winter Wedderburn such a frequent attendant at these sales. That hope, and also, maybe, the fact that he had nothing else of the slightest interest to do in the world. He was a shy, lonely, rather ineffectual man, provided with just enough income to keep off the spur of necessity, and not enough nervous energy to make him seek any exacting employments. He might have collected stamps or coins, or translated Horace, or bound books, or invented new species of diatoms, but, as it happened, he grew orchids, and had one ambitious little hothouse. "I have a fancy," he said over his coffee, "that something is going to happen to me today." He spoke, as he moved and thought, slowly. "Oh, don't say that," said his housekeeper, who was also his remote cousin, for something happening was an euphemism that meant only one thing to her. "You misunderstand me. I mean nothing pleasant, though what I do mean I scarcely know. Today," he continued after a pause, "Peters are going to sell a batch of plants from the Andamans and the Indies. I shall go up and see what they have. I shall buy something good unawares. That may be it." He passed his cup for his second cupful of coffee. "Are these the things collected by that poor young fellow you told me of the other day?" asked his cousin as she filled his cup. "Yes," he said, and became meditative over a piece of toast. "Nothing ever does happen to me," he remarked presently, beginning to think aloud. "I wonder why. Things enough happen to other people. There is Harvey, only the other week. On Monday he picked up sixpence. On Wednesday his chicks all had the staggers. On Friday his cousin came home from Australia. And on Saturday he broke his ankle. What a whirl of excitement compared to me." "I think I would rather be without so much excitement," said his housekeeper. "It can't be good for you." "I suppose it's troublesome. Still, you see, nothing ever happens to me. When I was a little boy, I never had accidents. I never fell in love as I grew up, never married. I wonder how it feels to have something happen to you, something really remarkable." That orchid collector was only 36, 20 years younger than myself when he died, and he had been married twice and divorced once. He had had malarial fever 4 times, and once he broke his thigh. He killed a Malay once, and once he was wounded by a poisoned dart, and in the end he was killed by jungle leeches. It must have all been very troublesome, but then it must have been very interesting, except perhaps the leeches. I am sure it was not good for him, said the lady with conviction. Perhaps not. And then Wedderburn looked at his watch. 23 minutes past 8. I am going up by the 11:45 train, so that there is plenty of time. I think I shall wear my alpaca jacket. It is quite warm enough, and my grey felt hat and brown shoes. I suppose. He glanced out the window at the serene sky and sunlit garden, and then nervously at his cousin's face. I think you had better take an umbrella if you're going to London, she said in a voice that admitted of no denial. There's all between here and the station coming back. When he returned, he was in a state of mild excitement. He had made a purchase. It was rare that he could make up his mind quickly enough to buy, but this time he had done so. There are Vandas, he said, and a dendrobe, and some phalaenopsis. He surveyed his purchases lovingly as he consumed his soup. They were laid out on the spotless tablecloth before him, and he was telling his cousin all about them as he slowly meandered through his dinner. It was his custom to live all his visits to London over again in the evening for her and his own entertainment. I knew something would happen today, and I have bought all these. Some of them, I feel sure, do you know, some of them will be remarkable. I don't know how it is, but I feel just as sure as if someone had told me that some of these will turn out remarkable. That one, he pointed to a shriveled rhizome, was not identified. It may be a phalaenopsis, or it may not. It may be a new species or even a new genus, and it was the last that poor Batten ever collected. I don't like the look of it, said the housekeeper. It's such an ugly shape. To me, it scarcely seems to have a shape. I don't like those things that stick out, said his housekeeper. It shall be put away in a pot tomorrow. It looks, said the housekeeper, like a spider shamming dead. Wedderburn smiled and surveyed the root with his head on one side. It is certainly not a pretty lump of stuff, but you can never judge of these things from their dry appearance. It may turn out to be a very beautiful orchid indeed. How busy I shall be tomorrow. I must see tonight just exactly what to do with these things, and tomorrow I shall set to work. They found poor Batten lying dead or dying in a mangrove swamp. I forget which, he began again presently, with one of these very orchids crushed up under his body. He had been unwell for some days with some kind of native fever, and I suppose he fainted. These mangrove swamps are very unwholesome. Every drop of blood, they say, was taken out of him by the jungle leeches. It may be that very plant that cost him his life to obtain. I think none the better of it for that. Men must work, though women may weep, said Wedderburn with profound gravity. Fancy dying away from every comfort in a nasty swamp. Fancy being ill of fever with nothing to take but chlorodyne and quinine. If men were left to themselves, they would live on chlorodyne and quinine, and no one round you but horrible natives. They say the Andaman Islanders are most disgusting wretches, and anyhow, they can scarcely make good nurses not having the necessary training. And just for people in England to have orchids. I don't suppose it was comfortable, but some men seem to enjoy that kind of thing, said Wedderburn. Anyhow, the natives of his party were sufficiently civilised to take care of all of his collection until his colleague, who was an ornithologist, came back again from the interior, though they could not tell the species of the orchid and had let it wither, and it makes these things more interesting. It makes them disgusting. I should be afraid of some of the malaria clinging to them. And just think, there has been a dead body lying across that ugly thing. I never thought of that before. There, I declare, I cannot eat another mouthful of dinner. I will take them off the table if you like and put them in the window seat. I can see them just as well there. The next few days he was indeed singularly busy in his steamy little hothouse, fussing about with charcoal, lumps of teak, moss, and all the other mysteries of the orchid cultivator. He considered he was having a wonderfully eventful time. In the evening, he would talk about these new orchids to his friends, and over again he reverted to his expectation of something strange. Several of the vandas and the dendrobium died under his care, but presently the strange orchid began to show signs of life. He was delighted and took his housekeeper right away from jam making to see it at once, directly he made the discovery. "That is a bud," he said, "and presently there will be a lot of leaves there, and those little things coming out here are aerial rootlets." "They look to me like little white fingers poking out of the brown," said his housekeeper. I don't like them." "Well, why not?" "I don't know. They look like fingers trying to get at you. I can't help my likes and dislikes." "I don't know for certain, but I don't think there are any orchids I know that have aerial rootlets quite like that. It may be my fancy, of course. You see, they are a little flattened at the ends." "I don't like 'em," said his housekeeper, suddenly shivering and turning away. "I know it's very silly of me, and I'm very sorry, particularly as you like the thing so much, but I can't help thinking of that corpse." "But it may not be that particular plant. That was merely a guess of mine." His housekeeper shrugged her shoulders. "Anyhow, I don't like it," she said. Wedderburn felt a little hurt at her dislike to the plant, but that did not prevent his talking to her about orchids generally, and this orchid in particular, whenever he felt inclined. "There are such queer things about orchids," he said one day, "such possibilities of surprises. You know, Darwin studied their fertilization and showed that the whole structure of an ordinary orchid flower was contrived in order that moths might carry the pollen from plant to plant. Well, it seems that there are lots of orchids known, the flower of which cannot possibly be used for fertilization in that way. Some of the cypripediums, for instance, there are no insects known that can possibly fertilize them, and some of them have never been found with seed. But how do they form new plants? By runners and tubers and that kind of outgrowth. That is easily explained. The puzzle is, what are the flowers for? Very likely, he added, my orchid may be something extraordinary in that way. If so, I shall study it. I have often thought of making researches as Darwin did, but hitherto I have not found the time, or something else has happened to prevent it. The leaves are beginning to unfold now. I do wish you would come and see them." But she said that the orchid house was so hot it gave her the headache. She had seen the plant once again, and the aerial rootlets, which were now some of them more than a foot long, had unfortunately reminded her of tentacles reaching out after something, and they got into her dreams, growing after her with incredible rapidity. So that she had settled to her entire satisfaction that she would not see that plant again, and Wedderburn had to admire its leaves alone. They were of the ordinary broad form and a deep glossy green, with splashes and dots of deep red towards the base. He knew of no other leaves quite like them. The plant was placed on a low bench near the thermometer, and close by was a simple arrangement by which a tap dripped on the hot water pipes and kept the air steamy. And he spent his afternoons now with some regularity, meditating on the approaching flowering of this strange plant. And at last the great thing happened. Directly he entered the little glass house, he knew that the spike had burst out, although his great Philoniophis lowy hid in the corner where his new darling stood. There was a new odour in the air, a rich, intensely sweet scent that overpowered every other in that crowded, steaming little greenhouse. Directly he noticed this, he hurried down to the strange orchid, and, behold, the trailing green spikes bore now 3 great splashes of blossom from which this overpowering sweetness proceeded. He stopped before them in an ecstasy of admiration. The flowers were white, with streaks of golden orange upon the petals. The heavy labellum was coiled into an intricate projection, and wonderful bluish purple mingled there with the gold. He could see at once that the genus was altogether a new one, and the insufferable scent, how hot the place was! The blossoms swam before his eyes. He would see if the temperature was right. He made a step towards the thermometer. Suddenly, everything appeared unsteady. The bricks on the floor were dancing up and down, then the white blossoms, the green leaves behind them, the whole greenhouse seemed to sweep sideways, and then in a curve upward. At 4:30 his cousin made the tea, according to their invariable custom. But Wedderburn did not come in for his tea. "He is worshipping that horrid orchid," she told herself, and waited 10 minutes. "His watch must have stopped. I'll go and call him." She went straight to the hot house, and opening the door, called his name. There was no reply. She noticed that the air was very close and loaded with an intense perfume. Then she saw something lying on the bricks between the hot water pipes. For a minute, perhaps, she stood motionless. He was lying face upward at the foot of the strange orchid. The tentacle-like aerial rootlets no longer swayed freely in the air, but were crowded together, a tangle of grey ropes, and stretched tight, with their ends closely applied to his chin and neck and hands. She did not understand. Then she saw from under one of the exultant tentacles upon his cheek there trickled a little thread of blood. With an inarticulate cry, she ran towards him and tried to pull him away from the leech-like suckers. She snapped two of these tentacles, and their sap dripped red. Then the overpowering scent of the blossom began to make her head reel. How they clung to him! She tore at the tough ropes, and he and the white inflorescence swam about her. She felt she was fainting, knew she must not. She left him and hastily opened the nearest door, and, after she had panted for a moment in the fresh air, she had a brilliant inspiration. She caught up a flower pot and smashed in the windows at the end of the greenhouse. Then she re-entered. She tugged now with renewed strength at Wedderburn's motionless body and brought the strange orchid crashing to the floor. It still clung with the grimmest tenacity to its victim. In a frenzy, she lugged it and him into the open air. Then she thought of tearing through the sucker rootlets one by one, and in another minute she had released him and was dragging him away from the horror. He was white and bleeding from a dozen circular patches. The odd job man was coming up the garden, amazed at the smashing of glass, and saw her emerge, hauling the inanimate body with red-stained hands. For a moment he thought impossible things. "Bring some water," she cried, and her voice dispelled his fancies. When, with a natural alacrity, he returned with the water, he found her weeping with excitement, and with Wedderburn's head upon her knee, wiping the blood from his face. "What's the matter?" said Wedderburn, opening his eyes feebly and closing them again at once. "Go and tell Annie to come out here to me, and then go for Dr. Haddon at once," she said to the odd job man as soon as he brought the water, and added, seeing he hesitated, "I will tell you all about it when you come back." Presently Wedderburn opened his eyes again, and, seeing that he was troubled by the puzzle of his position, she explained to him, "You fainted in the hothouse." "And the orchid?" "I will see to that," she said. Wedderburn had lost a good deal of blood, but beyond that he had suffered no very great injury. They gave him brandy mixed with some pink extract of meat, and carried him upstairs to bed. His housekeeper told her incredible story in fragments to Dr. Haddon. "Come to the orchid house and see," she said. The cold outer air was blowing in through the open door, and the sickly perfume was almost dispelled. Most of the torn aerial rootlets lay already withered amidst a number of dark stains upon the bricks. The stem of the inflorescence was broken by the fall of the plant, and the flowers were growing limp and brown at the edges of the petals. The doctor stooped towards it, then saw that one of the aerial rootlets still stirred feebly and hesitated. The next morning the strange orchid still lay there, black now and putrescent. The door banged intermittently in the morning breeze, and all the array of Wedderburn's orchids was shriveled and prostrate. But Wedderburn himself was bright and garrulous upstairs in the glory of his strange adventure.
Right. Simone, what did you think of the story?
Yeah, I think it was a solid piece of botanical horror. Like, obviously, I think we all saw the twist coming, and it was quite well seeded. I don't think it did anything surprising, but I think it did what it did solidly. Like, had a good time. Got what I wanted from the tin kind of mood.
I actually didn't see the twist coming, and I feel really dumb.
How did you not see the twist coming? What did you think was going to happen?
I don't know, I thought you might have an adventure where his orchid turns out to be famous or super cool or unique or something. I don't know. I didn't expect it to eat him.
Yeah, okay.
Did you know?
Fair enough, I guess.
I feel my impression of this story was slightly skewed by the fact that I first read it in a book of stories that was called Botanical Horror, and I knew that all of them were about terrifying plants. So I kind of didn't know what was going to happen.
Sense.
But I can see the way, like, if you didn't know that, you could go in thinking, oh, well, maybe this plant will bring some drama into his life like he wants. Maybe he'll fall in love, or I can't remember what else he had on his list of things he was jealous of, but something like that would happen for him.
I thought it might inspire a life like his orchid hunting friends who just adventured through the wilderness or something like that.
Yeah.
And then mysteriously died on top of the flower.
Yeah. When I read it again, I was like, this twist is super obvious. How did I not see this coming? But I didn't, so...
I think it can be easy to get immersed in a story the first time you read it. So you don't really think about how it's going to end, even if you could theoretically figure out the ending if you actually stopped. But I think that's generally a good thing, that most people don't and can just get involved.
Yeah, I the first time I read this story, I thought it was really neat, and I liked that it had positive ending, even though it was such a horrifying experience. He was just pleased to be alive and pleased he had an interesting story to tell people, which I thought was really neat.
Yeah, I think his character arc is my favourite thing about this story. It's super interesting, and it has actually raises some weird points about how we perceive what it means to live, as grand as that sounds.
Right. So what did you think of Wedderburn's longing for drama, which is kind of what we've been talking about here?
So I think it's really funny that when he's listing out all these things that he's never done, he's like, oh, people fall in love, they get divorced, all these dramatic things are happening. And several times he mentions breaking bones, as if, like, breaking a bone, oh, how dramatic. You must have really lived if you've broken a bone. And I think pointing out the kind of weird contradiction in that nobody really wants to break a bone. It's not a good thing to have happen, and yet it's perceived as somehow a sign that you've lived a full life is prevalent in the rest of the story. And it kind of serves as an underlying metaphor where apparently struggling or suffering is almost seen as a good thing, where he feels like his life is boring in some ways because he has no conflict, because he is perfectly content with what he has. And shouldn't that be good? And instead, he's like, no, I would much rather a plant almost killed me and then I could tell everyone about it. Isn't that really interesting?
I mean, the story ties it to ideas of gender, doesn't it? Like, it's men who have to be hurt in order to have lived kind of within his story.
That's true, yeah.
The female character makes quite a point about, actually, no, I'd much rather live quietly. Like, why would you want this? Actually, the plant creeps me out. Like, it's a very, I think, masculine thing, or stereotypically masculine thing, to promote aggressiveness and conflict and the idea of, like, risk-taking behavior. So it's not so much, I think, that he's using talking about having lived, but I think what he's really talking about is how stereotypically masculine he is in the story compared to some of his other friends, in that plant keeping isn't perhaps the most, like, stereotypically masculine hobby for a guy to have. He doesn't have a wife that would, promote his heterosexuality to the world. He's just got his housekeeper who's his cousin. And plants in particular are often coded quite female anyway. Like, particularly orchids have a history of being, like, very much the monstrous feminine. So I don't know if there's something interesting there or not, but...
That's interesting. It kind of underlines this idea that it's about how people perceive him rather than him actually being happy.
Yes. But then I think so much of our life experiences are kind of based around our kind of goalposts of how people perceive us. Because it's how we measure against others, right? For better or worse.
So you're thinking that he wanted something to fight?
It seems like he did. He said he wished something would happen to him. And all the things that he considered having happened were, for the most part, uncomfortable. In some way.
There's also the kind of theme, I guess, of transformation, because you don't know what the orchids are going to turn out when you get them as, like, the seeds or in the condition he initially buys them as, which I guess can also be applied to life and to the character, and that what he comes out with at the end as he kind of blooms from his experiences different to what he started out as.
It's true. I never thought about gender in this story at all. I'm thinking about it a bit more.
Yes, it's not an angle I really expected, but it is there. I also like his I don't know if this is like normal, but his almost like sort of like self-destructive attitude. I feel like that's quite a human thing. I don't know if others have experienced this, but in times of like when everything is just going fine, I kind of understand that desire to just mess something up just for the hell of it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I don't trust it. It makes me uneasy. I wish something would go wrong almost, like just so that, I don't know, things felt more, I don't know if exciting is the right word, but maybe real, or I don't know. Yeah, I do understand.
Or in control.
Yeah.
If you're the one who messes it up, at least you know how it's going to happen.
I mean, I think it's attached to this idea of feeling like you haven't lived. I can see how like almost self-destructive tendencies can emerge from that, even if only for a moment. Even though it's quite a whimsical story, I think there's something very real in there.
Would agree.
Have you ever listened to someone tell you a really long, dramatic story of how things have gone terribly wrong for them, and you're sort of saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and on the other hand, you're thinking, "Nothing ever happens to me. Oh my god."
Yeah, I know, right? Like some people just seem to manage to find drama.
Yeah, strange and interesting skill. I sometimes wonder how much when people tell stories they're exaggerating. Which I think is another point for Wedderburn. Like the plant really did try and kill him, so this is a juicy story to tell. Okay, so there's a bit of backstory in here about how the kid came to be in this gentleman's collection, and Wedderburn went to buy it from an auction because the poor gentleman died. Did you think it was well integrated into the rest of the story? I thought maybe it was a little bit clunky, but yeah, what did you think?
I didn't really notice the first time I read it. The second time, I kind of saw what you meant. Like it's just kind of put in there. I guess once you know where the story's going, you can see the puppet strings, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
I personally found it fairly obvious. Like I didn't know exactly what the plant was going to do, but I knew it was going to be something to do with his death, and that something similar would probably happen. It was just kind of a question of what.
And then there's a line in there about like, oh, perhaps this was the last orchid he collected before he died. Oh my god.
It's kind of weird that like somehow makes it more valuable or something.
I mean, it's true though. We do assign value to like final things. It's particularly if it's by someone famous, right? Like there's an exclusivity and a kind of notoriety or gossip behind it.
I agree that
people love people's
do.
final things.
It's just really weird. I think as she points out, like
yeah, macabre.
Someone died on this. I don't want that.
I guess there's a sense of this is the thing that he died for, therefore it must be really valuable because he gave his life. So that's what I sort of read from it.
Yeah, I think there is that kind of line of thinking. It's such a fallacy that it doesn't make sense.
Do you think it would have been better to see the orchid attack Wedderburn on screen? I know that's not quite right because this is fiction. Yes. Did you know what I mean? Like it cuts to him being found afterwards by his cousin, which seemed a bit, I don't know. What did you think of it?
I found that weird. You got rid of the main drama of your story and cut to the female protagonist who you didn't even bother to give a name.
I was thinking she didn't have a name.
Also, like, that's the climax of your story. Like, it's just really weird to cut away at that part.
I mean,
it's the most exciting bit.
I have a few ideas. I can only speculate. I have a few ideas about why maybe he did it this way. I think in some ways, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but in some ways it raises the stakes because I think at the time, at least, maybe not so much now, it would have been very strange to kill off your perspective character while you were in their head. Stories, especially of the time, they had the sense that there needed to be someone left to tell the story, right? So I think by cutting away to someone else, you've in some ways increased the chances or the opportunity to kill off Wedderburn. I think that doesn't really work nowadays, but that's maybe one of the ideas behind it. I also think, I suppose one of the ideas you think about when choosing what POV to do a scene from, or who to be the perspective character in a scene, is how much agency they have. And he's kind of just stuck there for most of that conflict. She's the one who actually tries different things and tries to save him. So you are giving the honors of being a perspective character to the one who's actually doing things, which does make sense. And I'd argue that there's pretty equal stakes for either of them. I mean, sure, dying is bad, but being the lady who watches this poor guy die and then I don't know what the hell would happen to her, that also seems very bad. So it kind of makes sense.
It kind of does. But then there's also the fact that he constructed it so that his protagonist immediately fainted. Which makes sense if, like, the idea is that the flower lures people in with its scent, which is the kind of vibe you get. And I suppose it makes sense that the plant would want its prey kind of prone. And there are other ways you could go around that. Like, you could make it go into kind of trance or whatever and have him struggling against the trance. So in that sense, like, it was a deliberate decision to make sure your main character throughout the entire thing suddenly had no agency.
I suppose, but I feel like telling that story, H.G. Wells didn't want to go into that point of being in the character's head while he's being attacked, because either because it would be too uncomfortable or it would be just wouldn't be interesting. I'm in pain, you know. I think maybe he considered he didn't want Wedderburn to save himself, perhaps because he was described as quite ineffectual, and he also wanted to show the scene from an outside perspective or from someone who can actually do something about it. I mean, I'm just guessing, but these are my ideas as to why he did it this way. And I don't think it's bad. I think it's just different from what we would expect.
I would have liked to seen a bit more from Wedderburn. Like, I would have liked to see, like, Plant maybe, like, move a bit or, like, grab his hand or just something before it cuts away. Just to, I don't know, I feel like there's a really, like, moment of horror there that's lost. Just a final kind of, it's definitely the freaking plant that's doing this, would have been really good before we went to the other perspective of the cousin finding him and being like, oh god, he's being eaten, which I guess is still pretty horrifying.
You wanted your dramatic reveal moment.
Did.
Yeah, I kind of agree.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I do agree.
It was sad that it was missing. All right, so what about the ending then, which is, I guess, just like we've discussed, says, well, I'm still alive and I've had an interesting story now. Would that be your perspective if you were attacked by a plant in your greenhouse? Because it seems pretty diddly chill to me.
Maybe it would be. You got to look on the right side.
Yeah, you survived at that point. Like, what else are you going to do except tell a great story about it?
Loses all his plants, though. Poor man. He's put quite a lot into his collection, and they all die.
Yeah, he doesn't really seem that bothered. I guess he thought it was worth it.
No, he doesn't. Maybe. Still.
I thought that was a really nice kind of like twist to put on at the end of the story, because it's unexpected, but it makes sense given what we've read so far. So it's just, if anything, maybe that's the twist in the story. That he's actually happy about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely wouldn't want to collect any more orchids after this experience, but maybe he is merrily back to collecting orchids. Or actually what I hoped is that he fulfilled his longing for more stories to tell and became an orchid hunter. Which, if no one else has anything to say about this story, will lead me into my little bit of research I did about this.
Oh yeah, I had no idea this was really a thing. It sounds crazy that people would actually do this. They would go and look for orchids.
Really exotic locations such as Philippines, the Andaman Islands, jungles. I think in South America as well. So, orchid fever. It began in 1818, and an orchid accidentally ended up flowering in London. The chap said he thought it was a parasite.
How does it accidentally end up in London?
That's what I mean. I don't think it was an accident. The chap who sent it claimed that it was just something he was using for packing material or some other specimens of importance. but it ended up flowering because, yes, maybe because of a heat wave or something. And people in London were like, whoa, look at this, because orchids were very sort of unusual and beautiful flowers. So that kind of kicked off this craze for orchid fever. So in Victorian times, orchid hunting became very fashionable, which was when the story was written. People would go to like incredible expense and lengths to collect them, and orchid hunter was actually a profession. So you'd get these chaps who would go on expeditions to these amazing exotic locations just to find and bring back orchids to the UK so they could sell them. And they would make money out of doing that. Now, half of the orchids would die on the trip back to the UK because our climate is not really built for orchids, which is why this one dies when the greenhouse is left open. We're not hot enough, basically. It's pretty cold and rainy in the UK, which is not good for orchids. So yeah, they would do this. And honestly, I have not read much about it, but what I have read is absolutely crazy. So here are some actual things that have happened to orchid hunters. They've been eaten by tigers, burned alive, held hostage. And other collectors have attempted to sabotage them by pissing on their orchid specimens because that kills them.
That kills them.
And that kills them. And it was a very competitive hobby. So even if you were miles and miles away from England, you met a fellow in your profession who was also like you collecting orchids, he would not be your friend. He'd just be like, I've got to make sure this guy doesn't collect more orchids than me. I've got to make sure he doesn't get the rarer ones than me. I've just got to sabotage him in whatever way that I can.
It's insane.
It was intense. I think orchid hunting does still exist to some extent, but not to the not the way that it used to.
There was really crazy demand for it. And that made people go a bit nuts.
Yeah.
I do love an orchid.
They are beautiful, and I think they're much easier to obtain these days. But yeah, just a little interesting piece of history for you, which gives some context to the story as well. I was thinking what the modern equivalent would be, and I was like, would I go into the deepest depths of the jungle to collect a really rare Yu-Gi-Oh card? I was a bit like, no, probably not.
It's like Pokemon Go, right? It's just like a craze where everyone's into this one
maybe
thing.
If they had a shiny Charizard or whatever blooming in the middle of a volcano, people would go and find it. Although I'm sure these days, like, the people who made the game would get in tons of trouble for encouraging. It wasn't that a thing? Weren't people going out onto the railways to try and get rare Pokemon? And they had to put signs up.
Yeah.
Like, no Pokemon Go
still kind of happen.
It's just the human spirit. It just wants what it wants. It doesn't care about danger when it comes to that Pikachu, I guess, or that orchid.
It's funny to me that nowadays it's like games or something like that we get obsessed over. Back in the day, it was just like ordinary things like plants or like pineapples. Everyone went crazy about pineapples for a bit, and they were just like they were really expensive, and only the rich people had them. So if you had enough money, you just buy a pineapple and like display it in your checkout. Oh, it's a pineapple, right? And it just seems like crazy now.
Yeah. I think some people do still collect quite.
I remember the first time I tried a pineapple. I was pretty delighted. Also, have you ever seen one growing? Like, a little plant on the ground, they're adorable.
No.
I have not.
I never really thought about how they grew. I imagine them falling off a tree like a coconut.
I'll send you pineapple pictures later.
Is that not how it works?
Yeah, I think I thought the same. Because they have like leaves on top. Maybe they're like they're not root vegetables, are they? Wait, I need to Google this now. How do pineapples grow?
Oh, it's like a really kind of spiky plant, I guess. It's kind of like an aloe vera.
Yep, looks like it. Anyway, on that note, should we end it there? Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with our final episode very shortly. Bye.